Hey, welcome to Divorce on Planet Earth, Kate Scharff's real-world advice for well-intentioned humans, a show for anyone who has shared life, love, and intimacy. Today's episode, Finding the Right Divorce for You, Part 2. What is collaborative divorce? I'm your co-host, Jane Prelinger. Your host is Kate Scharff. Hey, Kate.
Hey, Jane.
Kate, we are very excited to continue our conversation with our friend and colleague, Suzy Eckstein. Hi, Suzy.
Hello again to both of you.
In our last episode, Finding the Right Divorce for You, Part 1, Suzy did a great job of walking us through the maze of divorce process options. And Suzy, you offered advice for selecting an attorney who can help find the right process for you. Now, in Part 2, she's going to introduce us to a process that is near and dear to Kate and Suzy, collaborative divorce. Suzy, for listeners who might not have heard Part 1, I have the honor of introducing you again. Suzy is a family law practitioner in Rockville, Maryland, and is barred in both Maryland and the District of Columbia. She has extensive experience in family law and estates and has been featured in Bethesda Magazine's Top 25 Divorce Lawyers. She's an adjunct professor at her alma mater, the University of Maryland School of Law. Suzy's been a leader nationally and locally in the field of collaborative divorce, and among her many contributions in collaborative divorce, she's a founding co-president of the Collaborative Project of Maryland, a nonprofit organization providing collaborative services to Maryland families of modest means. Welcome.
Thanks for that introduction, Jane. It's a very pared down introduction in the sense that it doesn't even begin to represent all of your accomplishments as an attorney, but it does focus on those that relate to collaborative, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm really glad we are. So let me just get us going with the most basic of questions. Suzy Eckstein, what is collaborative divorce and how is it different from other processes?
So collaborative divorce is an out-of-court settlement process where the parties and professionals work together to find resolutions that work for everybody. It's a very supportive process, and there are other professionals who are involved besides attorneys. It's private, efficient, and there really are 4 cornerstones to the process, which we talked a little bit about in the first session, but I think it might be helpful to just go over again and talk about it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
Okay. So number 1 is that the first thing I said about what collaborative is, that it is a process where the parties and professionals really work together to resolve whatever they need to resolve, and they try and do it in the best way possible for the children, if there are children involved, and each of the parties involved. You make that commitment upfront and in writing to do that. That way, there is no other process where we do that commitment in writing. Some people might go into those processes with that intention, but they don't put that in writing. The second difference is that it is a completely transparent process, meaning that anything that either party needs to know to make good decisions going forward is shared. It's shared voluntarily without being asked. In other processes, if you're asked the right question or you feel like sharing something, you might get information. In this process, you have an affirmative obligation to share it.
So I think what you're saying is if you don't know that your spouse has an account in the Cayman Islands and you don't think to ask, you will still find out.
That is correct. And you probably will find out, you're more likely to find out in the collaborative process than you might in some other process. And we can go in later, some more detail about why that is.
Great. So you mentioned that this is a settlement-only process. Can you just say a little bit more about that for our listeners, what that actually looks like on the ground, what that means?
Sure. So that would be the third difference from other processes, is that it's for settlement only. And what that means is in any other process, court is absolutely hanging over. Nobody's made any kind of commitment not to go to court. They've just said, we'll try this first, in effect. In collaborative, the idea is that it's for settlement only. You're going to stick with it till you figure it out. And if everybody is sitting around the table, nobody's supposed to get up from the table if they hear an option that they don't like and say, well, forget it then. I'm going to court. And that happens a lot in other processes. It happens in the collaborative process too, but the commitment that people have made not to do that usually brings them back to the table pretty quickly. Emotions get high, it happens, but they've made a commitment not to, so it's easy to bring them back to the table.
Mm-hmm. So what would happen if somebody did decide to leave the process and to go to litigation?
So that brings us to the fourth difference from other processes, and that's if for some reason it can't settle in the collaborative process, then the professionals who were involved cannot be part of the litigation. That is probably the piece that most clients show immediate concern about when I'm talking about this process. So what we talk about is that, one, mostly they show concern because they've been referred to whatever attorney that they've come to. People do find attorneys online, but some people have been told that this is the attorney that they should use. And so they're concerned about losing that attorney. So what I would say is that I think that you have a better chance because of settling it in this process. It really does up your chances of settling it. But if for some reason it doesn't work out, I do know many fine attorneys that I can refer the client to, and I can help transition them. It's not like they can't have me talk to the other attorney to help them to share the information about what's happened, but they will have to transition. Mm-hmm. The other piece is that what that does for the process, that piece that says professionals can't litigate, is it has the professionals all in. So both feet in the settlement process rather than one foot in the settlement door, the other in the settlement process. And the one foot they have in the court door, they're thinking about how they can use the information that's happening rather than focusing on coming up with creative solutions. So I think it creates a safe container for everybody involved to be able to have a better settlement process.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important point. I mean, what you're saying is that your chances of settling are not just because people don't want to give up their attorneys, which is fair, but that also that if you're not having to worry that what you say can and will be used against you, you might feel freer to consider other options or to be more vulnerable in the process.
Yeah, I think freer to be more vulnerable, to explore in detail other options, and feeling like you're supported to do that by actually all the professionals around the table and not just your own attorney.
Just to go back for a sec to this important point that you can't be represented in litigation by your collaborative lawyer, what would happen to the work product? In other words, drafts of agreements or working agreements that you have been playing around with or have come to in the collaborative process if you were to go to litigation or if you were to leave the process and go to another process?
Mm-hmm. So those documents could be passed on to the new attorney so they could learn about what has happened, but they couldn't be admitted in court. So any documents that are created as a result of the collaborative process will not be in Maryland and DC, under the Uniform Collaborative Law Act, would not be admissible in court.
Okay, great. So that sort of gets back to this worry about considering options that you don't want to be stuck with in a potential adversarial process. Okay.
Yep.
So once you have kind of given your client this gloss, which is a relatively high level gloss on the collaborative process, but probably as much as any person in this situation can take in initially, can you share with us some of the questions that you typically get from people who are intrigued but potentially still anxious?
Mm-hmm. Well, so after I go through the different processes that we talked about and give them a little more detail about collaborative, I usually talk about what other pieces there are in the collaborative process, if that's where they settle. I mean, I'm going to explore whichever process speaks to them in more detail. And if it's collaborative, then we'll talk about the other people involved. And that would include mental health professionals and financial neutrals. The financial neutral helps folks create a budget and pulls together all the finances. And the mental health professionals can help the parties deal with their communication and emotional angst and also help them create a parenting plan. So when I talk about that, sort of at that high level, I get the question of, well, isn't this going to cost me a lot of money? I'm worried. I'm hearing about all these different people. So that's one of the main questions. And what I would say is that lawyers used to do all those pieces of the pie. We're really talking about a pie with a whole bunch of different pieces. And lawyers used to do the whole pie. And now we have mental health professionals and financial neutrals who are involved to help us do their piece of the pie. And they usually do it a lot better, a lot more efficiently, and a lot more cost effectively.
And I will say we typically have lower hourly rates.
Yes,
so that's
true.
But what you're really saying is, look, you're going to spend the money on these things. Doesn't it make sense to spend it on the people who are experts in that part of your process?
That's correct. Yes.
We're going to talk a little more about what that looks like.
Yes.
When we have a sort of a conversation about a team. and how a team works in a few moments. But when clients hear this from you, okay, it's a team model, it's a multidisciplinary model. Do you not hear, wow, that sounds like a lot of cooks in the kitchen. It must be expensive.
Yes. So that's really the pie conversation. We want them to, you can pay the lawyer their hourly rate, or you can pay the person who's better suited to do that piece of the pie. So for instance, I have a counseling undergrad degree, but I never went on. So I hope that I apply that to talk to people, but I know that people who are mental health professionals who have the training do a lot better in helping people navigate the conversations about their children.
Okay. Yeah. Did you want to say more about that? Or?
No, I was just going to say the main question that people often, depending on what's on their minds and happening in their lives, is what if I have a secret that I don't want to share? Because it's a transparent process and you're supposed to share. And one, they may be uncertain about whether it's something they need to share, but mostly they think about things and realize that they should share them and are afraid about having to share them.
So what would you say to that person?
So what I would say is that it is likely that whatever secret you have is going to come out in another process, certainly in a court process, but probably in other processes in many different ways. And if that secret can come out in the collaborative process, we can talk about how it's going to come out, when it's going to come out, and think ahead of time about how to make it come out in the best way to help them move forward. And that usually helps people feel a little calmer about that, especially when they realize that you really can't hide things. There are lots of, any good attorney is going to find out what they need to know if necessary.
I also sometimes say to people, the truth will out. It's possible that it might not out during your divorce process, although it likely will, whether you like it or not. But what would happen, say, if this financial piece of information or this personal piece of information came out after your divorce process and you didn't have the supportive professionals sort of helping each of you to sort of work that through and think about the implications of it? What kind of impact would that have on your relationship with your then ex and your family and the possibility of you ending up in court or someplace you really don't want to be?
Right. I think that's right. That's right on point.
Suzy, on this issue of secrets, what other kinds of concerns, questions do you hear from clients related to that?
So when I discuss the transparency of the process and that if I ask them specifically if they have anything they wouldn't want their spouse to know, do they have any secrets that they're worried about? And I assure them that when they tell me these secrets in this first meeting, it's confidential. I can't share those secrets. And we talk about whether or not they want to enter into the process as a result of those secrets. And I talk to them about how it might come out anyway. So that way they can decide whether or not they want to move forward. But so it's really important to tell your attorney that you have some things that you're concerned about and you don't want your spouse to know, and talk to them in detail about what those things are and see if you can work out a way that you can feel comfortable entering the process if those things are going to be shared. I'd say most of the time that is something that can easily be done.
So I just want to repeat something you said that I think is really important on this point. You're saying that until or unless you decide to move into the collaborative process, everything you discuss with your lawyer is still confidential.
That is correct.
So you don't have to worry that you're telling them something you don't want your spouse to know.
Right. You don't need to be transparent until you actually sign what they call a participation agreement, which then starts the process.
Okay, great. So I think it would be helpful for us to talk about what a collaborative case looks like. Like, what does this look like on the ground? What's the flow? I know that in the beginning, when people are hearing the touchstone, sort of the cornerstones of collaborative, the main philosophical points and the protocols, it can feel like a lot of information, maybe too much to digest. And I expect that some of our listeners will feel that way today. And I think probably worth saying, you won't remember all of this. That's okay. We just want to give you a gloss and enough for you to sort of know whether or not this is something you want to know more about. And you get to ask these questions of your attorney, what did you say about that? And what does this look like again? And what does that person do? As many times as you want to, but we're going to make a stab at it. So I'm going to start with asking you about, you mentioned that there can be other professionals involved besides the two attorneys, right? There can be mental health professional or professionals. There can be a financial person. There's also a a special potential role for a mental health professional having to do with a constructive way of bringing the voice of your child or children in. Can you say a little bit about those roles and how each of them relate to each other?
Sure. So I would start just randomly with the financial person. Traditionally, two attorneys would sit down with their clients, help them do a budget, gather all the assets together, all the paperwork, and then they would make a list and then they would compare it. And there'd be a lot of double work happening and not a lot of trust necessarily in what they were sharing. In the collaborative process, we have what we call a financial neutral, and that person could be a CPA or a financial planner that has a special certification. And what they do is they sit down with each person and help them do a budget for what their future is going to look like in their new situation, so that they can have that information to inform their decisions. And they also gather all the information. It's one person gathering all the information. They put it in a very cohesive form, alert people to things like tax issues. And that way, the attorneys can let the financial neutral be the person gathering and disseminating the information in a form that everybody can understand and is done in a neutral way.
So when you say information, just for people for whom that might not be obvious, what are those big chunks of information? What are the categories of information, for example?
So what retirement each person has, what kind of investments or bank accounts, their house, how much it might be worth, talking about that, thinking about just gathering what the mortgage is on it, all the financial details that you would need to figure out a comprehensive plan moving forward.
And you mentioned a budget. I think putting a budget together, especially for the spouse who hasn't traditionally really managed the family finances, and especially when lots of things are not known yet and it's all kind of hypothetical, can be pretty anxiety producing for people.
So I think that brings up one of the points of the collaborative process that I think can be most helpful, especially in using the financial person. It is typical, even when both parties are informed and understand finances, that one person usually handles the finances and the other person, even though they could perfectly well handle it, just doesn't know anything about it because that's how they have functioned. Or it could be somebody who really doesn't have a lot of financial experience and they've never done it. What the financial neutral can do is help bring that person, in either situation, sort of up to speed. And they can do it at their pace. With permission, they may either do it alone with a person or they might do it together with both people present. But to help that person so that when they walk in the room and they have to start thinking about options, they have all the information and they're sort of on the same playing field that their spouse is.
So when you say options, you're talking about various ideas that they and their team will generate about how to handle issues related to finances.
Right. So just a brief sort of overview of what looks like on the ground is we're going to first talk about, and we talked about this in the last section, that the client's goals, each person's goals, are the paramount driver of this process, what it is that they want to achieve. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to gather the information, and the financial neutral is part of gathering that information that they need to know in order to generate different options to give them the widest creative thinking that they can. So as opposed to other processes where oftentimes you do a proposal, somebody does a counter proposal, we're working together to come up with as many options. It's a brainstorming session. Most people understand that from business, right? If you brainstorm more options, the more you brainstorm, the more likely it is you're going to land on something that's best. And then we're going to evaluate the options. So the financial neutral is one of the key components to the gathering of the information.
And can you give us an example of how a financial neutral might help in that process of evaluating an option, say, on how to divide assets, or whether or not there needs to be some form of support from one spouse to the other to handle cash flow issues?
So they have tools that they can generate reports to look at what the cash flow is. So taking the budgets and what each person makes and sort of seeing where they are on their bottom line, and then figuring out how money can flow back and forth in order to take care of any deficit, if there's a deficit. They also can help with understanding the tax issues. So if somebody has a large retirement and one person wants to keep the house and the one other person wants to keep the retirement, they're not equally from a tax perspective, and they can help talk about how they might handle things in order to sort of, if they plan to equalize things, what to do about the tax difference and identify it and what to do about it.
Would a financial neutral ever make a recommendation to a couple about what they should do with their finances?
So I think what happens in the process is that we try and get the clients to put up as many options that they can think of. If they are stuck or if they are sort of out of options and the financial neutral or actually an attorney or anyone else of the professionals in the room has a different idea, which, I think of that as they're putting up another option, sort of their recommendation. We would just put it up as an option and then evaluate it, because really it goes back to the people who are getting the divorce. It's their lives, and a final recommendation from somebody else might not necessarily speak to their lives. Mm-hmm. I think it's not that it never happens. Sometimes, people need help in finalizing, but we try to make every effort to have them involved and understand the decisions they're making.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's so special about the role of the financial neutral is that besides their neutrality, right? In another process, spouse one might go get their own financial person, spouse two might get their financial person, and then it becomes dueling. That becomes part of the dueling opinions. Whereas a financial neutral, just like everybody else on the team, is really open to thinking about options that, in fact, dedicated to working toward options that work for everyone. And what's so remarkable is that financial neutral is just as interested in the emotional implications of decisions as everybody else is.
So that's absolutely true. And divorce itself is an event that is both, all three: emotional, financial, and legal. All three of those components have to be dealt with in the process, most of the time simultaneously, in order to have a good resolution.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the financial. We will talk a little more about the legal. Say something about the emotional and about the role of a mental health professional on the team.
So there are several roles that the mental health professional can play. One of the roles is to help people have a more efficient process. And the ways that they do that are they help people communicate. Oftentimes when people are getting divorced, they're unable to communicate effectively. They can't hear each other. So the coach, we call it a divorce coach, can help the parties do that. And secondly, can help them contain their emotions. As we said, it's an emotional process. And so the idea of containing emotions is not talking about what went wrong, how can we make it better, but how can I contain my emotions so I can do the work we need to do when we're all together trying to figure things out. So that's one role. Mm-hmm. The other, I would say two other roles. One is the role of a parenting coach. So working with the parties to come up with a parenting plan. And sometimes that can be done with one coach, or sometimes each party has their own coach in that conversation. The last role would be what we call the child specialist. And that is to bring in the voice of the child, which is one of the unique things about the collaborative process that you don't really get in other processes. The child specialist will talk to the children. They're not going to ask them who they want to live with. They're very skilled at talking to children to get information that the parents might want to use in order to figure out what kind of parenting plan. So they then bring that information to the parents. They're not there to make a final recommendation. They're there to give information to the parents so they can figure out what they want to do from there based on that information.
Mm-hmm. I would just add a couple of little additional points to what you say, since I do often
do that.
Yeah, I do function in both the coach and child specialist role. I would add one, I think, important role that a mental health people can play on a team, and that is not just to help to manage the emotions of our clients, but to manage our own. It's a bit of a shift for the attorneys, sometimes for the neutrals, certainly for the mental health professionals, from the traditional way of working to working in this in the collaborative situation. And attorneys are learning a whole new way to advocate for their clients that has much more, much less to do with winning the biggest piece of the pie than it has to do with finding constructive resolutions for everybody that are forward thinking and sustainable. But for the mental health people, it's not about doing therapy, but it is about figuring out how to, I would say, contain, yes, emotion, but you can certainly let it all out in your individual meeting with your mental health professional, but to find a way to manage those feelings constructively in meetings. So to massage out whatever psychological kinks there are that would get in the way of resolution. And then in terms of the team, we are people, and we can sometimes get triggered and sort of fall out of that sort of collaborative state of mind in which we're thinking about everybody's needs. And the mental health people are there to sort of keep the process on track, not just logistically, but psychologically.
Yeah, I think that I've experienced that, and that is extremely helpful. Just like judges are people, and they are going to bring their own stuff. Professionals also do that.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions that you sometimes get from people who are considering collaborative?
Well, I think one question I get is, we fight all the time. We don't really get along. We have a lot of things that are difficult in our relationship. So is this something, it sounds like you have to be super friendly in order to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because you're collaborating.
Suzy, that really is bringing up a question for me. I'm thinking of, first of all, the internal professional team getting along with each other, but also it sounds like you really have to really be pretty high functioning to do this. Are there ever cases in which collaborative are just not a good idea for a family, for a couple?
So I think there are some situations, and I can talk about that in a minute, but I do want to say that for most people, when they're going into a divorce, there are many difficult issues and people feel like there's no way they can work together. As a matter of fact, I think that this process it's good for anybody, but it's especially good for people who are feeling very adversarial and have a lot of difficult situations, because as you just heard, they have a team to support them and help work through those issues. You can't work through those issues when you're just going to court and you just have an attorney.
That's a really good point.
And
yes.
In mediation, there's one neutral there. The attorneys just talking to each other. So I think the additional support makes it well suited for people who are high conflict. However, there may be some situations where it's not a good idea, but it's really hard to tell from the beginning. I had clients who came in and they've actually given me permission to sort of talk about their story, where mom came in and talked to me about how there was a lot of anger management issues, there was alcohol issues, there was drug use issues. And they had a lot of really difficult things going on. And I thought to myself at the time, it was one of my first cases. This is never going to work. I don't even know if I'm going to tell this client about collaborative. And I did tell her about it because I just decided that I would. And both her and her spouse latched onto it, thought that they wanted to try it, and they did an amazing job. And they did such an amazing job that the sort of typical thing that we as litigators want to bring into court, we drag the poor teachers into court. And the teachers always say, well, when he was with dad, the homework wasn't done. In this process with these folks, they switched week to week, and the teacher said they couldn't tell who the children were with. So they really worked hard. However, there are some cases, let's talk about abuse cases, I think that comes to most people's minds. If it's physical abuse, there may be a way, especially depending on where it emanates from. For instance, if it's a PTSD situation, somebody who, let's say, came back from Iraq, you might be able to do some counseling in advance to see if there's a way to handle it so that people can feel comfortable and it makes sense for them to sit in the room and talk to each other. I have talked to therapists where they've said that if it's a coercive abuse situation, and I don't know, Kate, if we need to say more about what that means, but it's not generally physical abuse. It is really an emotional abuse, and the person who's doing it they're usually somewhat intractable. It's you really can't, and it may look like you can move them, but then you don't move them. And then the other person feels very unsafe in that situation. I will also say that sometimes when people come into you and they look like they'd be a great candidate, one of my biggest red flags is when they say they're best friends. Maybe not so much. So you just can't really tell, and you just have to keep taking the temperature throughout and making sure that you're attending to whatever's coming up and assessing as you go along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree that it's really where collaborative shines is in some of these higher conflict cases, or in cases where people are really worried that it can't work, including, I had a case where the husband was really worried about the wife's drinking, and she was drinking a lot, and she was drinking when she had the kids, and she was driving when she had the kids and when she'd been drinking. And she never acknowledged, we actually took it into collaborative, she never acknowledged that she had a drinking problem, but she was willing to work within the process to put things in place that would ensure that the children will be safe in her presence. It was sort of a breathalyzer system, both in the car and in the apartment, and start out with supervised visits, moving toward hitting benchmarks that allowed her to spend time, with the kids on her own. She didn't like it, but she had been advised by her attorney that this was her best shot at actually having that in court. She would get nothing. And this was her best shot at working toward having a relationship with her children. And we were able to finish that case successfully. And she did spend time with her kids. I don't see how that could have happened in any other process.
There are many things that can happen creatively in the process that can't happen in other processes. I had reminded of one case where the husband worked at a very high-powered job, made a lot of money, worked a lot of hours, and was totally stressed out. He really wanted to switch to doing something else, which would be much lower paying. And the wife was reticent because she wanted support. She needed support. And she basically said, I don't believe that you are going to do that. And so they made an agreement that he would pay her support. And if he actually made the shift, then they would change the support. And there was a lot of going back and forth. And I just can't imagine that happening in any other process.
So can you say something about what your understanding is of what helped that wife be able to move in that flexible direction?
So I think a couple of things. One was us taking the time to hear what was underneath why the husband wanted to do that, and he provided some information on what was going on with his health and psychologically what was going on with him. And that was really helpful for the wife to be able to hear and sort of take in as, sort of just not what she was hearing at first was, you just don't want to pay me any support. And I think the other thing that happened was what we do in the process is we do options. So one option was he pays her support till he retires. One option was pays her support and maybe a little bit less support, but maybe give a little bit more of the retirement. There were so many options that were explored in different ways that I think she felt like, one, she heard him, and two, there are all different ways to do this. And she really was willing, if he really stopped working at the high-powered job, to allow herself to change her lifestyle.
And so part of that process must have been getting underneath her anxieties about what would happen if he didn't pay support in the traditional way. And there must have been a way of reassuring her that she would be okay.
Yeah. And that the financial neutral when we went through all the options, the financial neutral was able to quantify what that would look like for her going forward and see that she could be okay regardless of what happened. So absolutely.
Do you ever get people who say to you, I really kind of like the idea of this, but I don't think my spouse will, or my spouse has already hired a litigator, or how can I broach this topic with my spouse?
Yeah. So we have a lot of conversation about how to talk to your spouse about this process. One thing especially if the client has already seen a therapist, I ask them somebody they've been seeing for a while who also knows about the relationship, might have even met the spouse, is to talk with them and maybe even role play, how the conversation would go, because that person is probably aware of their dynamic and what might be the best way. If they try and broach it, or if they determine that it's not good for them to be the person to broach it, sometimes I can send a letter to the spouse saying that your spouse is interested in using this process and doing this in an amicable way. So there are all different ways. We give them information about websites they can go to in order and give to their spouse. One thing I always tell people is don't go to your spouse and say, I want to do this process, because that usually makes people feel backed up against the wall. What you might want to say is, here's something I learned about. Would you please look into it and let me know your thoughts? And I think that can help. But the good thing about the collaborative process is when you're approaching somebody about a process to use, the opening line is, this is a process that makes sure that both our needs and our kids' needs are taken care of. And that usually disarms people.
Suzy and Kate, do professionals need any special training to practice collaborative divorce?
So there is special training. You need to have a certain number of hours in order to practice and take the collaborative training, which can be either a 2 or 3 day training. It's often interdisciplinary. At least around here, it's actually always interdisciplinary, where it's the attorneys and the mental health professionals and the financial neutrals train together so they can learn how to interact together. There is no law that says you have to have a certain amount of training, but as collaboratively trained professionals and with the international organization, they have certain standards that they want you to aspire to. And if you have to do, if you want to be a member of the organization. And that also includes doing some mediation training, because that is a component of collaborative, how that works. It works similar to mediation, yet there are more pieces and more support in that process.
So is collaborative divorce, you may have said this already, but is it, and of course the training available sort of all over the country? Can a listener in Idaho, do they have access to collaborative divorce? No offense, Idaho, that just drew that name out of the hat. But is this pretty common practice in the U.S.?
It's fairly common practice. You can go to the international website to get where all the trainings are being held. They're all listed there. So there could be one in Virginia. There could be one in Idaho. There could be one in Italy. So there are trainings happening all over the world. When you go to once a year, the international organization has a forum, and there are people from all over the world. They do some basic training there. So there are lots of opportunities in this area to get training and other places too.
I think that the professionals who are drawn to collaborative they come to it because they've worked in another way and they don't want to do that anymore. I mean, I know, Suzy, I think you have really shifted, even though you do lots of different kinds of work and work in different modalities within family law, the principles of collaborative you integrate into everything you do. I mean, I think it actually changes the way I live.
I think it definitely does that. I actually even tell my law students that it helps them when they go to court if they have to go to court.
Yeah, I think it does. There are degrees of difficult even in that process. One question that I think a lot of people have is, okay, am I responsible for finding all these people? How does a team come together?
So there is usually an entry point where you start talking to, maybe you're talking to your CPA about going through a divorce, you're talking to your therapist, or you're talking to a friend or an attorney. So the entry point, if you're talking to an attorney, a financial person, or a mental health professional, if they're trained or if they know people who are trained, they can help you find the other professionals. If they don't know about collaborative, then hopefully they would, look it up themselves and, help you find the other professionals.
So where can our listeners find more information about collaborative, including, I guess, how to find a collaborative professional in their area?
So one of the easiest places to go to that is the most encompassing is collaborativepractice.com. That is the website for the international organization. And on there, they list collaborative practitioners who are trained in your area. You can put in what city you live in, and you can find a collaboratively trained practitioner just by going there. It also lists the practice groups, the groups that are doing the continuing legal education and building the community in order to do collaborative practice.
Yeah. I mean, many communities around the country, and as Suzy said, increasingly the world, have these practice groups, these local or at least statewide, if not, even sort of more granular than that, like a part of a state or a county. It's like a sort of little guild, a group of professionals who learn together and work together. And if you Google collaborative practice, Boise, you will find where the closest practice group is, and you can hone in on the professionals who are closest to you. I just wanted to go back quickly to this question of collaborative training, and you spoke to this, Suzy. I think that people who decide to become collaborative practitioners have decided that they're going to be lifelong learners, or at least the ones who are good at it and successful at it and stay in it. That this process of being a collaborative practitioner is kind of an evolving one. You get the basics down, then you do sort of an intermediate and an advanced training, and then you find areas that are of interest to you, and you keep going. You once you got the basics down, then you realize, well, there's a lot I need to know about myself. There's a lot I need to know about what happens in marriages and what happens when they begin to come apart and how that affects us as a team. I mean, it just sort of goes on and on.
Yeah, I think it's an evolving area. We keep evolving it into a practice that will be most helpful to the clients who come to us. So continuing to learn with each other and think about how we can do things in a better way. The best collaborative practitioners are those who feel like they need to continue to learn how to do things better.
So you've given us a look into both sides of this as consumer and provider, and it's really, really quite fascinating. So I think we will put links for finding collaborative practitioners in your areas and, Suzy, as well as your contact information on the blog divorceonplanetearth.com. Suzy, thank you so much for being with us and giving us this comprehensive introduction to collaborative divorce. You and Kate both come at this as experts, from Kate from the mental health sort of orientation, and you, Suzy, as an attorney. And you've really given us so much food for thought here. You know, we need all the help we can get dealing with this kind of difficult life transition. And I'm sure many of our listeners will want to look into this collaborative further. Yeah. So thanks again. And as always, to all of you out there, thanks for listening to Divorce on Planet Earth, Kate Scharff's real world advice for well-intentioned humans. If you'd like to know right away when we have a new episode, we invite you to follow Divorce on Planet Earth on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, or on Twitter, where we are at Divorce for Humans. That's divorce, the number 4 humans. You can learn more about Kate and what she's writing and thinking about on her blog, divorceonplanetearth.com. If you have an idea for us for a future podcast, please write to us at info@divorceonplanetearth.com. We hope that what you hear on this show will be helpful, but since everyone's situation is different, our content is not intended as a substitute for clinical advice or recommendations. I am your co-host, Jane Prelinger. Your host has been Kate Scharff. Our producer is Eric Piguero. See you next time.